Well, good morning. I'm going to start with a video that shows who we are and why we are here. I work for the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Research on Biological Resources. So,
when we talk about biodiversity, we refer to the various ways in which life manifests itself on Earth. It describes the variety of animals, plants, fungi, and microorganisms and their genetic differences, as well as the way in which these species interact with each other and with everything around them. Colombia is one of the 14 most biodiverse countries because with only 1% of the surface of the Earth, it owns 10% of all biodiversity. For this, it is known as a mega biodiverse country. Impressive, right? And what is currently being done locally to conserve biodiversity? In the Humboldt Institute, we promote, coordinate, and conduct research that contributes to the understanding, conservation, and sustainable use of the biodiversity as a factor of development and welfare for the people in our country. We serve as an interface between science and politics, so that through knowledge, the authorities can make decisions with sustainability criteria that favor the protection of ecosystem services and the communities that live and work in those territories. The adaptation to change and the knowledge of the ecosystem services is our secret to understand the territory, to manage it, and use its resources in order to guarantee water supply, food security, and to protect ourselves from landslides and floods, improving land use, crop planning, and using new technologies that help to prevent emergencies and improve productivity. This will allow the communities and different sectors to participate in the planning and implementation of programs of climate change adaptation, to share knowledge and develop risk management skills, factors that can assure us a better future.
well, thank you for listening. As you can see, this resonates a lot with what we've been hearing for the last 2 days. So I want to present now our advances on the pilot study for Colombia with the TEEBAgriFood framework. We are at the proposal stage, as I think everybody else. So we already did a first stage pre-scoping exercise where we did a background study on political context for agriculture and environment, where we recognize that the country has a wealth of environmental policies, at least at the national level. We even have regulation guiding environmental economic valuation that is pretty recent. We also have a lot of agricultural policies, but most of them don't have an environmental component or perspective to them at all. Maybe just having one exception, which is the family and smallholder agriculture policy. In the first stage, we also did institutional scoping workshop where we started with a list of ecosystems that we wanted to prioritize to do the study. In the workshop, we recognized that focusing on an ecosystem was not the correct way to go about this, and shifted to what we call a landscape approach. So a focus on a geographical area, and in particular, we defined the Putumayo department as the area we wanted to focus on. The Putumayo department is at the southern western side of Colombia. It is between the Amazon, or it ranges from the Amazon to the Andes Mountains. Here we can see zoom. It has a lot of ecosystems because it goes all the way through the altitude. We can see in green are the shapes of protected areas or natural protected forests. And in red, we have shapes where we can see the resguardos indígenas. So we also have a lot of land that is assigned and under the authority of indigenous populations. This area also and in particular the Piedmont, has very fertile lands. So we have there a conflict of land use because cattle ranching for milk and for meat is present, and also vegetable and other crop raising is present. This Piedmont area has 80% of forests, so it's still very rich in biodiversity. And on top of it, we have a lot of information available for this area. So we are now thinking of focusing not on the whole department, but more on the Piedmont region. The Humboldt has a lot of related experience to the type of analysis done within the framework. So I'm picking here just a couple of examples. I'm starting with a methodology itself. So the Humboldt has an integrated evaluation of biodiversity and ecosystem services methodology. This methodology focuses more on a problem, on a conflict, studies governance as a whole, and looks at valuation from three perspectives: from the social perspective, from the ecological perspective, and then from the economic perspective as well, but as a problem-solving tool. Then we also have, say, the framework somewhat applied, in particular to an ecosystem, the tropical dry forest. That is an example that is currently ongoing. There, in particular, we're trying to even put together field measures that we're taking with actually a couple of invest tools, and then going all the way to matching them with economic valuation. So we're trying to put together all the chain that is mentioned in the previous methodology. We also have done a couple of environmental strategic assessments of policies, plans, and programs. These are normally sectoral, but also have a lot of work in creating in a participatory way policy scenarios, different policy scenarios. The last item that I have there is a supply and demand for ecosystem services study. We have it already done for the Altillanura area, which is the lowlands on the east of the country. This one is done as, at least as most of the other ones, with this landscape approach, where we take into account that the area where we do crops, it's not, at least in Colombia, not only for one crop, but it mixes uses and it mixes land uses. So we take into account all the interactions. We look at productivity, and not only agricultural, but ecological. And we look at welfare and livelihoods and measure those as well. How do we do this? Well, we do it in a also dynamic systems approach. This looks, I'm not intending to explain all of this, but here we have models, dynamic systems models for nutrients, so phosphorus and nitrogen, for carbon, and for water. And we do it maybe at a scale lower than our colleagues, but so at the landscape scale, but it's very aligned with that. We look also at interactions between all these stocks and flows. Then we also model in the same way, say in this exercise cattle for milk and for meat, and then couple it with our models of ecosystem services. So that's what we're initially proposing to do. We get results at a scale where we think that a significant portion of the externalities are internalized and we make them visible. We can assess the results like a time series, so through time and also through space. So this is all also geographically linked, and the information, most of it is also in geographical terms. So going now into the proposal that we are doing, the objective is to generate scientific evidence of socio-economic and environmental impacts of different land use scenarios in Putumayo, maybe a little bit smaller in Putumayo, to guide the agricultural, environmental, and land use planning policies. Here I'm not actually going through the activities we aim to do, but through what I think makes it have a larger impact or buy-in So we are intending, and the Humboldt Institute has experience relating to indigenous communities, and we intend to do this transversally, and actually we want to do the scoping with them too. So what areas and what value chains we want to focus on wants to be something that we all agree on so that it's useful for them. We also need, and because the TEEB wants to inform higher instances as well, we want to be in permanent articulation with political stakeholders. So we are doing a committee, a technical or a steering committee that we want to meet with periodically. The Humboldt Institute, fortunately, is also strong in communications. We have been able in the last 25 years to put forward and highlight or mainstream biodiversity in Colombia. So we are going to do a communication strategy for the results as well. So not only with stakeholders during the whole project, but also at the end, hopefully, outcomes. And the results, we want ideally that they get involved in the assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services that the Institute is doing under the IPES methodology and with the contribution to nature conceptual framework. Now, to finish, we already talked about this a little bit in the first sessions on Monday, but we are facing challenges, and we have learned, although we are still starting, some lessons. We've had trouble actually incorporating the agricultural decision makers to our process and to the workshops we've done. The time frame is a little bit short for what we're tending to do. We have in the area a post-conflict process, which can go different ways. And, well, we're hearing a lot here about the impact these studies have to have. So we, as an institute, are very willing to inform decision makers, but we are not an environmental authority in the country. So we cannot implement any of our recommendations. The most we can do is recommend. So we are actually developing this stakeholder involvement strategy so that we hopefully at least have an audience, but we cannot commit to impact, say. Now, the lessons learned. We have to work with the communities, and in particular the indigenous communities, transversally all through the study so that we get the appropriation. We want them to learn about the methods, coincide in the scope, know the methodologies, and hopefully understand the value of the work we're doing. So, yes, and we also want to articulate and communicate with the decision makers. That's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I get my comment.
Thank you very much. Let's take about 10-15 minutes for questions before we go to the next session. So with that, can I ask if anyone has any questions they want to ask to any of the panelists, or any general remarks? Preferably questions. We have lots of comments today. Any questions first? Any questions? Yeah, Pietro.
A small question, more curiosity. I was wondering, what's the time frame of these projects? Is it like quarter or a year or more than a year?
I can answer that. The time frame of the project, currently the project ends the end of this year. We may seek an extension from the IKI Secretariat for various reasons, but currently ends the end of this year. Any other questions or comments to the panel?
I have a question, not necessarily for the panel, but I mean, I see that there is agri-food complexes are really complex and huge systems, no? How do you identify the specific inputs in the system that you have probability to change, to really insight, so that you can change the system and the path that the system is taking? I don't know if I made myself understand.
I think, well, sorry? Does anyone on the panel want to answer that, or? It's a very, okay, I would suggest, it's quite a difficult question in some respects. So what we have to do, my previous answer, is we have been, the reason it's taken a long time with IKI countries, we've been very, very precise in defining, as far as we can, the scenarios, and the scenarios look at different intervention options, which include inputs to the system. The inputs in the end, and the changes inputs to the system, in the end we're looking at because they're creating outcomes which we propose are going to be beneficial in terms of livelihoods, in terms of conservation outcomes. So we always have to look for changes in terms of inputs to the system which are viable, credible, for which there's a governance structure for that input change to occur. But as you pointed out, and you've seen in the last 2 days, the complexity of that is very large. And even getting to that point and decide on that intervention is a really interesting and instructive process. And I think we can say that certainly in each of the 4 stakeholder meetings, there were situations, for instance, where agriculture and ecosystems ministries were talking about this really for the first time as a consequence of our project. So even as you were mentioning in terms of the Millennium Institute, it very much is the case that even the process of applying the TEEBAgriFood study creates benefits, I would argue, which are very different than, say, for instance, an academic research proposal, say when I was at Edinburgh, where the academic decides in advance, but I'm looking at this compared to this, I'm now going to do it. Yeah? So there's been a 2-year process to make that happen, and a very constructive process today. Any other further questions or comments on the studies? Okay. Yes, please. Yasmin, go ahead.
I have a comment on what has been discussed also by Colombia, the difficulty of also including the agricultural sector. And I just wanted to share our experiences from Mexico and from our Inception workshop, which we held last week, because actually at this workshop we had like 50% from the agricultural sector participants and 50% from the environmental sector, and the workshop was actually hosted by the Agriculture Ministry. So maybe this is just of interest to the participants here, how we did it. I mean, on the one hand, we have a positive political situation at the moment in Mexico, but what we also did is that during the last years when we prepared starting the study, we very much focused our dialogue with the Agriculture Ministry on positive experiences. So there has been a lot of difficulties in the dialogue between the agricultural and the environmental sector, because also in Mexico there's a lot of subsidies, or there have been a lot of subsidies with negative impacts on the environment, but we kind of not mentioned it. When we engaged with the agricultural sector, we were looking a lot into their programs on agro biodiversity and genetic diversity in the agricultural sector. We picked a lot of case studies with small-scale farmers that we have, and every time we engaged with them, we only looked at the positive sides to really include them as part of the solution. And I think that is why we got this positive uptake from the agricultural sector and them really leading this TEEB approach. Because, yeah, even though there are a lot of problems with the agricultural sector, we focused on the positive examples. Just as a lessons learned from our first steps on TEEB, which might be helpful also for other countries.
Thank you, Yasmin. That is very helpful. And I think we've tried to do that. And then what I'll probably do is ask the panelists, and each of them in turn have mentioned this, but basically the challenges you faced in terms of the interaction and trying to get what may not be your core constituency on board. So I'll ask in a second. But just to say, what I presented on day 1 to introduce and day 2 to introduce, in terms of suggesting and presenting that TEEBAgriFood is not agriculture bashing, was taken through to Inception workshops as well. It was also taken through to the earlier dialogues that we had, even before the Inception workshops, with the ministries to make sure that they understood exactly what this project was about, and it was trying to create positive synergies, when in many cases agriculture and environment seem to be in conflict. And obviously, in terms of political economy, it's very sensible to steer away from certain issues which might be politically very, very sensitive, which we've tried to do as well. But why don't I just, as a final comment to the panel then, or question, you've touched on it already, but maybe go through, if you have any final comments, but particularly if you can talk about the interaction between agriculture and environment, and indeed other ministries, and the process of making that happen, how difficult it was, what you managed to achieve.
So I already mentioned part of this in the presentation. Effectively, we've had trouble getting good participation from our agricultural ministry in particular, but we've tried to also focus on agencies that are part of the ministry and not directly the authorities, so we've got some participation from them. And we are developing strategies through partners that we already have to be able to get there. So we are partners with the Agricultural Research Institute of the country. So through them, we might be able to get more attention. Of course, framing and steering away from any of the maybe contradictory parts is definitely part of the strategy. What has been also a problem for us is during these years, we're changing government and with a very different perspective from the previous one. So we did a lot of the previous work with the old one. Now we have a new one, so we have to start over. That happens.
A generic feature of what we're doing in the TEEB world. I mean, we're talking in general about 3-year projects, and we tend to find we tend to be in every case in the middle of some political changeover or catastrophe or both. Okay, so it's very, very difficult. We have to allow for the fact that there is a political economy here. This is a 3-year project. We have to allow for the fact there'll be changes, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Better or worse, I don't mean in any kind of, only in the sense that we have a certain agenda to livelihoods and conservation, and it can be very complicated for the project to try and realign ourselves, even if that realignment is actually potentially beneficial, each time there's a change. And that doesn't apply just in Colombia, it applies across many of the countries we work in.
Maybe as a response, one of the things we've actually done is try to not only engage high, I guess, decision makers, but also technical practitioners that are more steady, at least in Colombia.
Thank you very much. For the Kenyan case, we didn't have at least challenges in the first instance because we took a different strategy of trying to do, we did meetings, dialogue at ministry level, capitalizing on the relationship that we had with our institution, National Museums of Kenya. So we did several meetings before the inception workshop, like 3 months before that, engaging officers, responsible officers for the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Agriculture. So, but the only challenge that we faced was because of the time lapse. Once you talk to one officer in charge of the ministry, there were like transfers, so we really had to restart again to engage new officers in the ministry. But it went very well because we did, like we went for Ministry of Agriculture, we had several meetings trying to explain to them the objective of the project. And it turns out that we were successful in a way, because by the time they were coming to the inception workshop, they already know what the objectives of the project were.
Good. Your experiences in Tanzania?
Okay, thank you very much. So at this stage, for the case of Tanzania, as you know, this project is actually hosted under Vice President Office, and basically they are dealing with the environment, and we have engagement with the Ministry of Agriculture as well. But of course, we don't foresee any challenge in terms of putting on board all these stakeholders together in the future. Of course, the main challenge has been the concern for environment and agriculture has been in terms of water availability, especially when you're talking of the Rufiji River Basin. We're talking of water availability for the environment vis-a-vis agricultural practices, which is going on upstream. So I don't foresee any challenge of engaging all these stakeholders and looking at different scenarios of policy change in engagement of the stakeholders.
Okay, in this state of the Thailand project, right now we haven't found any challenge yet, but from my previous experience in another project that I need to deal with the people from the government or farmer, So the first thing that we need to do is when we starting before starting the project, we need to talk to them in advance what we are doing and what outcome we are expect, and then we ask them to like help us to clarify or make some decisions that they are interested. So in this case, it's kind of like if they get involved since the starting of the projects, they are usually like we become like the co-worker, colleague, working together for entire project. So this is going to be the strategy that we plan to do. Yeah. But one thing that I experience but rarely happen is similar to the Kenya. Sometimes we're starting working with these people from these organizations, and then the project continue for some time, and then they change. So we need to start over again with the new one. So, but this happen, but rarely happen. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd like to bring this session to a close, and I'd just like to thank the participants in a normal way. So thank you very much.